Mencius begins his philosophy with a belief that stands in sharp contrast to those who see human beings as naturally selfish or corrupt. He asks people to look carefully at ordinary life rather than assume the worst about humanity. Imagine a small child suddenly wandering toward the edge of a deep well. Before anyone has time to calculate rewards or punishments, most people instinctively rush forward to help. They do not stop to ask whether the child belongs to their family, whether someone is watching, or whether they will receive praise. Compassion appears before calculation. To Mencius, this simple moment reveals something profound. Human goodness is not something invented by society. It already exists within the human heart. This does not mean that every person behaves well all the time. People lie, become greedy, act violently, and betray one another. Mencius sees these failures clearly. His claim is different. He believes such actions grow because the natural goodness within people has been neglected, damaged, or overwhelmed. Just as a healthy plant can wither if deprived of water and sunlight, the human character can deteriorate when placed in unhealthy conditions. The problem is not that people are born without goodness. The problem is that goodness requires care if it is to flourish. For this reason, he often compares virtue to a seed. A seed already contains the possibility of becoming a great tree, yet that possibility is never guaranteed. Without proper nourishment, it remains small or dies altogether. Human beings possess the beginnings of compassion, fairness, respect, and wisdom, but these qualities must be developed through habit, education, and reflection. Character is cultivated slowly, one decision at a time. This understanding changes the purpose of education. Learning is not simply filling the mind with information. It is helping people become what they already have the potential to be. A teacher does more than transfer knowledge. A teacher awakens qualities that are already present but have not yet fully grown. Every lesson should strengthen judgment as well as intelligence, because knowledge without virtue can become dangerous. Mencius also believes that emotions are not enemies of reason. Compassion, shame, respect, and the ability to distinguish right from wrong all play essential roles in moral life. These natural feelings are the starting points of virtue. They should not be ignored or suppressed. Instead, they should be guided and refined until they become stable parts of a person's character. Because of this, he rejects the idea that morality depends entirely upon fear of punishment. A society held together only by threats will never become truly just. People may obey while someone is watching, but they will not necessarily become better human beings. Lasting goodness comes from the heart willingly choosing what is right rather than merely avoiding consequences. His philosophy naturally turns toward government as well. A ruler should never govern through fear alone. Power can force obedience, but it cannot earn genuine respect. The greatest leaders inspire trust because they govern with fairness, compassion, and integrity. When people believe their leaders sincerely care for their well-being, loyalty grows naturally. When rulers become selfish or cruel, even the strongest government begins to weaken from within. Mencius repeatedly reminds rulers that the prosperity of a nation depends upon the condition of its ordinary people. Empty granaries, crushing poverty, and constant insecurity do not simply create economic problems. They damage the moral life of society itself. People struggling to survive often find it difficult to think beyond immediate necessity. Good government therefore begins by ensuring that citizens have the stability needed to live with dignity. He also believes that wealth and power should never become the highest goals of life. A person who sacrifices honesty for success may gain temporary advantages while losing something far more valuable. Reputation earned through deception is fragile because it depends upon maintaining an illusion. Genuine honor comes from remaining faithful to what is right even when doing so carries a personal cost. This belief demands courage. There will always be moments when truth is unpopular, when integrity seems inconvenient, and when compromise appears easier than principle. Mencius argues that these moments reveal who a person truly is. Virtue has little meaning if it survives only when circumstances are comfortable. Its real strength appears when it remains steady despite difficulty. He also understands that people influence one another constantly. Children learn from parents long before they understand formal instruction. Citizens watch the behavior of their leaders more closely than their speeches. Friends quietly shape one another through everyday habits. For this reason, moral example becomes one of the most powerful forces in society. Goodness spreads not only through laws, but through lives worth imitating. Throughout his philosophy, there is an unmistakable confidence in human potential. Mencius never claims that becoming virtuous is easy. It requires discipline, patience, and constant self-examination. Yet he refuses to believe that goodness belongs only to a gifted few. Every person possesses the beginning of it. The question is whether those small beginnings will be neglected or carefully nurtured throughout life. For Mencius, philosophy is ultimately an invitation to trust the better possibilities within human nature. Instead of assuming that selfishness is destiny, he encourages people to cultivate compassion, strengthen integrity, and build communities where the best qualities of humanity are given room to grow. When those qualities are protected and encouraged, individuals become wiser, societies become more just, and the ordinary acts of everyday life become the foundation of a more humane world. One of the most important ideas in Mencius' philosophy is that goodness is not something people borrow from the outside world. It grows from within, just as a river naturally flows downhill unless something blocks its path. The human heart naturally moves toward compassion when it is allowed to develop freely. Cruelty, greed, and dishonesty are not signs that human nature has failed. They are signs that something has interrupted its proper growth. This is why he pays so much attention to the environment in which people live. A child raised with care, guidance, and good examples has a far greater chance of developing virtue than one surrounded by fear, neglect, and violence. Human character is shaped by countless influences that appear ordinary at first. Family conversations, friendships, education, and daily habits quietly become part of who a person is. Change the environment, and over time the character often changes with it. For Mencius, this gives society an enormous responsibility. If people wish to create a more peaceful world, they cannot simply punish wrongdoing after it appears. They must also create conditions in which goodness can flourish before wrongdoing begins. A government that ignores poverty, injustice, or hopelessness should not be surprised when social disorder follows. People do not become virtuous by accident. They require opportunities to live with dignity. His concern for ordinary life is one reason his philosophy remains so practical. A hungry person struggles to think about morality while worrying about the next meal. A family living in constant fear finds it difficult to plan for the future. Mencius does not excuse harmful behavior, but he insists that wise leaders should remove unnecessary hardships whenever possible. Stable lives make moral growth easier than lives dominated by desperation. He also believes that every person must examine themselves before criticizing others. It is easy to notice another person's faults while remaining blind to one's own. The search for virtue begins with honest self-reflection. Every mistake becomes an opportunity to improve rather than merely a reason for shame. A person who refuses to acknowledge their weaknesses also refuses the chance to become wiser. This habit of self-examination keeps pride under control. Pride convinces people that they have already reached the highest level of understanding. Humility reminds them that there is always more to learn. Mencius admires those who welcome correction because they value truth more than their own reputation. Such people may admit mistakes more often, but they also continue growing long after others have stopped. His philosophy also places great importance on courage. Courage is not loud or aggressive. It is the quiet strength to remain faithful to what is right when compromise would be easier. There are moments when honesty carries a cost, when justice is unpopular, or when kindness receives no reward. Virtue reveals its true value precisely in those moments. Anyone can do what is right when it is convenient. Character is measured by what a person does when it is difficult. This understanding naturally shapes his view of leadership. A ruler should never depend entirely upon force because force can control actions without changing hearts. Respect cannot be demanded through fear. It must be earned through fairness, wisdom, and genuine concern for the people. When citizens trust those who govern them, stability grows naturally. When trust disappears, even powerful governments become fragile. Mencius goes even further by arguing that rulers exist for the people, not the people for their rulers. The strength of a nation should not be measured only by its armies or its wealth, but by the well-being of ordinary families. Fields should be productive, homes should be secure, and justice should be available to everyone rather than reserved for the powerful. A society that neglects these responsibilities slowly weakens itself from within. Throughout these ideas, one principle quietly remains unchanged. Human beings possess the capacity to become better than they are today. No one is born complete. Every day offers another opportunity to strengthen compassion, improve judgment, and live with greater integrity. Mencius believes this lifelong cultivation of character is among the highest purposes of human existence. The greatest achievement is not simply gaining power or knowledge, but becoming the kind of person whose goodness benefits everyone fortunate enough to meet them. A person of good character, according to Mencius, is not someone who has escaped every weakness. It is someone who refuses to stop improving. Human beings make mistakes, lose their temper, act selfishly, and sometimes fail to live according to their own values. These failures do not prove that goodness is an illusion. They simply remind us that virtue must be cultivated throughout an entire lifetime. The moment a person believes their character no longer needs attention is often the moment it begins to decline. This is why self-cultivation stands at the center of his philosophy. Before trying to reform society, reform yourself. Before demanding honesty from others, become more honest in your own words. Before expecting compassion from the world, practice compassion in your own daily life. Large changes often begin with habits so small that they are almost invisible. A patient conversation, a promise kept, an act of generosity that no one notices. These quiet decisions gradually shape both the individual and the community. Mencius also believes that every person carries an inner sense of right and wrong. It may become weakened through neglect, but it never disappears completely. There are moments when people know they are acting against their own conscience, even while continuing to do so. That inner discomfort matters because it reminds them that they have not entirely lost their moral direction. Conscience continues speaking, even when it is ignored. For this reason, he encourages people to protect that inner voice instead of silencing it. Repeated dishonesty makes dishonesty feel normal. Repeated cruelty slowly dulls compassion. Repeated selfishness narrows the heart until other people's suffering no longer seems important. The opposite is also true. Every honest decision strengthens honesty. Every generous action makes generosity easier the next time. Character grows through repetition, whether for good or for ill. His philosophy never separates personal virtue from public life. A peaceful society cannot be built by people who refuse to govern themselves. Laws may discourage certain actions, but they cannot replace integrity. No government can watch every conversation or every private decision. Eventually, every society depends upon the character of ordinary citizens. When people choose fairness without being forced, keep promises without being reminded, and help others without expecting praise, trust begins to spread naturally through the community. Education, therefore, becomes far more than preparation for work or social status. Its highest purpose is to shape judgment. A truly educated person should become more thoughtful, more balanced, and more capable of recognizing what is just. Knowledge that increases pride while leaving character unchanged has missed its greatest purpose. Learning should deepen humanity, not merely sharpen the intellect. Mencius is equally careful not to confuse success with virtue. Wealth, influence, and public admiration often create the appearance of a successful life. yet appearances can be deceptive. A person may gain everything the world celebrates while quietly losing honesty, kindness, and peace of mind. Another may live with little recognition, yet possess a character worthy of lasting respect. For Mencius, the second life is the greater achievement because virtue remains valuable even when fortune changes. This conviction gives people remarkable independence. If success alone becomes the measure of life, then principles are constantly sacrificed for advantage. If character becomes the measure instead, a person gains the freedom to refuse dishonesty even when it offers rewards. Integrity no longer depends upon circumstances, but upon deliberate choice. His reflections often return to hope. He refuses to believe that people are permanently trapped by their past. Someone who has lived selfishly can become generous. Someone ruled by anger can learn patience. Someone who has made serious mistakes can begin again. Change may require time and determination, but it remains possible because the capacity for goodness has never been completely destroyed. For Mencius, the greatest victory is not over rivals, wealth, or power. It is over the habits within ourselves that prevent compassion from growing. A person who learns to govern their own desires with wisdom, treat others with fairness, and remain faithful to what is right has achieved something that no changing fortune can take away. Such a life becomes an example to others, proving that the strength of a society is ultimately measured not by its buildings or its armies, but by the character of the people who quietly shape it every single day. Mencius leaves behind a philosophy built upon confidence in human potential rather than fear of human weakness. He never denies that people are capable of cruelty, dishonesty, or injustice. Those realities are impossible to ignore. Yet he refuses to believe they define what it means to be human. Beneath them remains the capacity for compassion, fairness, wisdom, and integrity. The challenge of life is not to create these qualities from nothing, but to protect and strengthen what already exists within us. For him, the measure of a successful life is not wealth, status, or power. These things can be gained and lost many times over the course of a lifetime. Character is different. Every honest decision strengthens it. Every act of kindness enlarges it. Every moment of courage deepens it. A person who spends years cultivating virtue possesses something far more lasting than public admiration. This is why he places such faith in education and self-reflection. No one is born complete. Every individual continues shaping themselves through countless ordinary choices. The smallest habits, repeated day after day, eventually become character. A person rarely becomes wise through a single dramatic moment. Wisdom grows quietly through patience, humility, and the willingness to learn from both success and failure. His philosophy also reminds us that goodness cannot survive in isolation. Families influence children, teachers influence students, friends influence one another, leaders influence entire nations. Every action becomes an example that quietly encourages others to follow. In this way, virtue spreads through society much like a ripple across still water. One sincere act of fairness often inspires another, and over time those small actions create communities built upon trust instead of suspicion. This understanding explains why Mencius expects so much from those who hold authority. Power is not a reward for personal ambition. It is a responsibility to care for the lives of others. A ruler who forgets the people has already forgotten the purpose of government. The true strength of a nation is not found in its wealth or military power alone, but in whether ordinary families can live with security, dignity, and hope for the future. He also offers a quiet warning. Human goodness can be neglected. Compassion can become weaker when selfishness is constantly encouraged. Conscience can become quieter when ignored again and again. Virtue does not disappear all at once. It fades gradually whenever people stop paying attention to it. For that reason, the work of becoming a better person is never finished. Every generation must choose once again whether it will cultivate kindness or allow indifference to take its place. Perhaps this is why his philosophy has remained meaningful for more than 2,000 years. It speaks to something people continue to recognize within themselves. Most have experienced the desire to help someone in need before stopping to think about personal gain. Most have felt the quiet discomfort that follows an act they know is wrong. Mencius sees these moments not as accidents, but as evidence that the human heart still remembers the difference between right and wrong. In the end, Mencius invites us to trust that the best part of human nature is real. It may become hidden by fear, pride, anger, or greed, but it is never beyond recovery. Through learning, honest self-examination, good examples, and the steady practice of virtue, people can become wiser than they were yesterday and kinder than they were before. His final message is both hopeful and demanding. Do not wait for a perfect world before choosing to do what is right. Begin with your own character. Protect your compassion, strengthen your integrity, remain humble enough to keep learning, and treat others with the respect you hope to receive yourself. When enough people live in that way, goodness no longer appears as a rare exception. It becomes the quiet foundation upon which a just and flourishing society is built. There are philosophers who explain how the world works. There are philosophers who explain how government should function. And then there are a handful of thinkers who ask a quieter but infinitely more difficult question. What is a human being before the world teaches them who to become? Mencius devoted his life to that question. He looked at a world filled with war, corruption, betrayal, greed, and political ambition. Yet he reached a conclusion that many people still find almost impossible to believe. Human beings are not born evil. They are born with the capacity for goodness. Not perfect goodness, not automatic goodness, but a natural moral potential that exists within every ordinary person. It was one of the most optimistic ideas in the history of philosophy, and it was also one of the most controversial. Because if Mencius was right, then cruelty is not humanity's natural condition. It is something that develops when our better nature is neglected, corrupted, or deliberately suppressed. This idea challenged nearly everything people assumed about power, education, morality, and government. It still does. Even today, people argue endlessly about whether human beings are fundamentally selfish or compassionate. Every news headline seems to provide evidence for both sides. One story shows breathtaking generosity between complete strangers. The next reveals shocking violence or exploitation. We witness kindness and cruelty existing side by side, often within the same person. Mencius believed this contradiction revealed something important. The human heart contains possibilities rather than fixed destinies. What those possibilities become depends greatly upon the world that surrounds them. He was born around 372 BCE, during China's Warring States period, one of the most turbulent chapters in the nation's history. Kingdoms struggled relentlessly for power. Alliances shifted without warning. Military campaigns devastated entire regions. Political leaders competed for influence while ordinary people carried the burden of endless instability. Children grew up knowing fear. Families were displaced. Harvests disappeared beneath marching armies. Trust became increasingly difficult. For many observers, such a world seemed to prove that human beings were naturally violent. Mencius looked at the very same world and reached the opposite conclusion. He believed that societies had become sick, and when a society becomes sick, even fundamentally decent people begin behaving in destructive ways. This distinction became the foundation of everything he would later teach. Very little is known with certainty about his earliest childhood, but tradition tells us that his mother played one of the most influential roles in his education. Throughout Chinese history, she became famous as a model of thoughtful parenting. One story has survived for more than 2,000 years. When Mencius was very young, the family initially lived near a cemetery. The boy naturally began imitating funeral processions during play. His mother watched quietly and decided that this environment was shaping his habits in unhealthy ways. So they moved. Their next home stood near a busy marketplace. Soon Mencius began copying merchants bargaining loudly, arguing over prices, and competing for customers. Once again, his mother observed what was happening. Again, they moved. Finally, they settled near a school. This time the young boy began imitating scholars, reading, studying, asking questions, and practicing respectful behavior. His mother remained there. Whether every detail of these stories is historically accurate matters less than the lesson Chinese civilization drew from them. Environment shapes character. Long before modern psychology studied childhood development, Mencius' life became associated with the idea that human potential depends greatly upon the influences surrounding it. Children are constantly learning, not only from instruction, from observation, from imitation, from the emotional atmosphere around them. This insight appears almost obvious today, yet in Mencius' time it carried enormous philosophical significance. If environments influence character, then governments carry responsibilities extending far beyond collecting taxes or maintaining armies. They help create the moral conditions under which citizens either flourish or decline. As Mencius grew older, he devoted himself to studying the teachings of Confucius, who had died more than a century earlier. Confucius had emphasized virtue, education, proper conduct, and moral leadership. Mencius admired these teachings deeply, but he did not simply repeat them. He expanded them. He asked questions that Confucius had only begun exploring. Why does morality feel natural to many people? Why do ordinary individuals often experience guilt after acting selfishly? Why does witnessing innocent suffering produce compassion, even among strangers? What exactly is happening inside the human heart? These were psychological questions long before psychology existed. Mencius believed every person possesses what he called the beginnings of virtue, not fully developed virtues, seeds, tiny moral capacities waiting to grow. Just as an acorn already contains the possibility of becoming an oak tree, every human being possesses the potential to become compassionate, just, wise, and morally courageous. But seeds alone are never enough. Without proper care, fertile soil, water, sunlight, and time, even the healthiest seed dies unnoticed. Human goodness works the same way. It must be cultivated. It must be protected. It must be practiced. Otherwise, fear, greed, ambition, and habits slowly overwhelm it. To explain this, Mencius offered one of the most famous thought experiments in all of philosophy. Imagine walking along a road when you suddenly see a small child about to fall into a deep well. Before thinking about rewards, before wondering whether anyone is watching, before asking whether the child belongs to your family, you instinctively rush forward. Why? Not because of law, not because of social approval, not because you expect payment. You move because compassion arises naturally. For Mencius, this spontaneous response revealed something profound. Human beings already possess the beginnings of goodness. The challenge is not creating compassion from nothing. The challenge is preventing life from slowly destroying it. This idea would become one of the most influential contributions to Chinese philosophy, and it would lead Mencius into remarkable conversations with kings, ministers, scholars, and ordinary people alike. For if human beings truly possess an innate capacity for goodness, then perhaps the greatest responsibility of every society is not merely to punish evil, but to create the conditions in which goodness can fully grow. As Mencius traveled from one kingdom to another, he was not searching for wealth or political office. He was searching for a ruler willing to listen. Like Confucius before him, he believed philosophy was not meant to remain inside schools or private conversations. Ideas had to shape governments, because governments shaped the lives of millions. A single wise decision made by a king could spare thousands of families from hunger, while a single foolish decision could condemn an entire generation to suffering. Yet everywhere Mencius went, he encountered the same temptation. Rulers wanted stronger armies, larger territories, greater tax revenues, more influence over neighboring states. Very few asked how to become morally better leaders. Mencius found this deeply tragic. He believed most kings misunderstood the true source of political strength. They imagined that fear created stability. Bigger armies, harsher punishments, and stricter laws seemed to promise lasting order. But Mencius argued that fear only produces temporary obedience. It cannot create genuine loyalty. People obey power while they are afraid. They follow virtue because they trust it. This distinction became one of the cornerstones of his political philosophy. A kingdom does not become stable simply because its ruler is powerful. It becomes stable because its people believe they are being treated justly. Imagine two neighboring kingdoms. In one, taxes become heavier every year. Farmers work harder, but remain poor. Officials enrich themselves through corruption, while ordinary families struggle through failed harvests. Soldiers are constantly recruited for wars that bring little benefit to the people who actually fight them. Citizens obey because they fear punishment. In the other kingdom, leaders govern with fairness. Taxes remain reasonable. Farmers keep enough of their harvest to feed their families. Judges cannot easily be bribed. Education is encouraged. The elderly are cared for. During difficult years, the government shares the burden rather than increasing it. Which kingdom will people defend more willingly? Which ruler will earn genuine loyalty rather than forced obedience? For Mencius, the answer was obvious. Human beings naturally respond to kindness with trust. They respond to justice with respect. A government that genuinely serves its people becomes stronger not despite compassion, but because of it. This was a revolutionary argument during the Warring States period, when military conquest dominated political thinking. Many rulers assumed compassion made leaders weak. Mencius believed the opposite. Cruelty often reveals insecurity. Compassion requires confidence. He frequently reminded kings that they governed human beings, not machines. People possess hopes, fears, families, memories, and emotions. Ignore these realities long enough, and no amount of military power can permanently preserve a government. One conversation recorded in the ancient texts captures his philosophy beautifully. King Xian of Qi once told Mencius about an incident that had stayed with him. A frightened ox was being led away for sacrifice. The king noticed the animal trembling with fear. Unable to bear the sight, he ordered that the ox be spared and another animal used instead. Some advisors mocked him. They called him sentimental, weak, unfit for leadership. But Mencius saw something entirely different. He told the king that this moment revealed the compassion already present within his heart. The problem was not that the king lacked goodness. The problem was that he had failed to extend that same compassion beyond a single frightened animal to the countless people living under his rule. That conversation reveals one of Mencius' deepest psychological insights. Most people do not become cruel because they completely lack compassion. They become cruel because compassion remains too narrow. It reaches family, but not strangers. Friends, but not enemies. Citizens, but not foreigners. One child, but not another. Mencius believed moral growth meant gradually widening that circle until concern for others became part of one's character rather than an occasional emotional impulse. This idea remains remarkably relevant today. Many people donate generously after witnessing a heartbreaking story online, yet they remain indifferent to larger systems producing the same suffering every day. Our emotions often respond to individuals more easily than to statistics. We care deeply about one face. Millions become difficult to imagine. Mencius understood this long before neuroscience or psychology existed. He recognized that moral development requires transforming brief moments of compassion into stable habits of character. That transformation depends upon education. Not education understood merely as memorizing information, but education of the heart. He believed children should not simply learn mathematics, history, or language. They should learn patience, honesty, self-control, gratitude, generosity, and empathy. These virtues do not emerge automatically. Like muscles, they become stronger through repeated use. Neglect them, and they weaken. Practice them, and they quietly reshape the entire person. For this reason, Mencius often compared moral cultivation to farming. A farmer cannot force a plant to grow. Pulling upward only destroys it. Instead, The farmer prepares fertile soil, removes weeds, provides water, and patiently allows nature to develop. Human goodness works the same way. Parents cannot force virtue into children. Teachers cannot manufacture wisdom overnight. Governments cannot create moral citizens through punishment alone. They can only create the conditions in which goodness naturally develops. This philosophy stood in sharp contrast to another influential school of Chinese thought that was beginning to emerge. The legalists argued that people were fundamentally selfish and required strict laws, harsh punishments, and constant surveillance to behave properly. Mencius rejected this vision completely. He believed that treating people as though they were naturally corrupt often encouraged the very corruption governments claim to oppose. Distrust produces more distrust. Fear produces deception. Cruelty teaches cruelty. If rulers expect only selfishness, they often create societies where selfishness becomes the safest way to survive. Instead, Mencius believed wise leadership begins with faith in humanity's better nature. Not blind optimism, but disciplined hope. A hope supported by observation, experience, and careful reflection on what human beings become when given justice, security, education, and the opportunity to flourish. It was an extraordinarily hopeful philosophy, yet it was also demanding, because if goodness truly exists within us from the beginning, then the greatest obstacle to becoming better is no longer fate, but the choices we make every single day. As Mencius continued his journeys through the fractured kingdoms of ancient China, he gradually realized that winning arguments was not the same as changing societies. He could persuade a ruler during a conversation, inspire scholars through careful reasoning, and move audiences with vivid examples. Yet human beings often return to old habits once fear, ambition, and self-interest reappeared. This forced him to confront one of philosophy's oldest problems. Why do people knowingly act against what they believe is right? If goodness truly exists within human nature, why does corruption become so common? His answer was both subtle and deeply psychological. The moral heart can be neglected. Just as muscles weaken when they are never used, compassion weakens when it is ignored. A person does not become cruel overnight. They drift there gradually. One selfish decision makes the next one easier. One dishonest act becomes another. A small compromise slowly becomes a permanent habit. Before long, people no longer notice the distance they have traveled from the person they once hoped to become. Mencius believed evil often grows through neglect rather than intention. Few children dream of becoming dishonest adults. Few young rulers imagine themselves becoming tyrants. The transformation happens quietly, little by little, choice by choice, habit by habit. This is why he placed such enormous importance on self-cultivation. To modern ears, the phrase can sound abstract, but Mencius meant something remarkably practical. Every day presents opportunities to strengthen or weaken one's character. Every conversation, every promise kept or broken, every act of patience or anger leaves a small impression upon the soul. These impressions accumulate over years until they become what we call personality. Character is not something we are born with fully formed. It is something we practice into existence. Mencius illustrated this idea through another unforgettable image. He spoke of a mountain that was once covered with beautiful forests. Day after day, people cut down its trees. Animals grazed upon the young shoots before they could grow again. Eventually, the mountain appeared barren. Someone arriving later might naturally conclude that the mountain had never possessed a forest at all. But that conclusion would be false. The forest had existed. It had simply been destroyed little by little. For Mencius, the human heart works the same way. People often meet someone who has become bitter, selfish, or indifferent and assume they were always that way. He disagreed. The seeds of compassion were once there. Repeated neglect, fear, greed, disappointment, and unhealthy surroundings slowly stripped them away. This was one of his most hopeful ideas, because if goodness can be damaged, it can also be restored. No matter how far someone has drifted, Mencius believed the possibility of renewal never disappears completely. As long as life remains, the moral heart can begin growing again through reflection, discipline, education, and deliberate acts of kindness. This optimism separated him sharply from philosophers who believed human beings required constant external control. He acknowledged the importance of laws, but he insisted that laws alone could never create a truly good society. A nation can punish crime. It cannot force compassion. It can enforce obedience. It cannot command sincerity. The deepest virtues arise from within. For this reason, Mencius argued that the greatest rulers were not those who inspired fear, but those who inspired imitation. Citizens naturally copy the character of those they admire. If leaders pursue wealth above justice, society slowly becomes obsessed with wealth. If leaders lie whenever convenient, dishonesty spreads downward through every institution. But if leaders display integrity, humility, and genuine concern for their people, those qualities gradually influence the culture itself. Government, therefore, was never merely about administration. It was moral education on a national scale. This belief led Mencius to make one of the boldest political arguments of the ancient world. He claimed that a ruler who abandoned virtue could lose the moral right to rule altogether. This was an astonishing statement in an age when kings often viewed themselves as beyond criticism. Mencius insisted that political authority depended upon moral responsibility. A king who oppressed his people, ignored their suffering, or governed through cruelty ceased to behave like a true king. Such a person had already undermined the very foundation of legitimate leadership. The people were not simply subjects. They were the purpose of government. Centuries later, philosophers across the world would develop ideas about accountable leadership, social responsibility, and the moral limits of political power. Mencius had already begun pointing in that direction more than 2,000 years earlier. Yet despite all his confidence in humanity's potential, he never became naive. He understood how easily fear could overpower compassion, how ambition could silence conscience, and how comfortable people become with injustice when it benefits them personally. That is why he never described goodness as automatic. It must be protected, nurtured, practiced. Every generation inherits the same moral seeds, but every generation must choose whether those seeds will flourish or wither. As the years passed, Mencius' reputation spread throughout China. Some rulers welcomed his counsel. Others found his ideas inconvenient, even dangerous. After all, a philosopher who tells kings that they exist to serve their people rather than themselves is rarely welcomed by every throne. Yet Mencius accepted this risk. He believed that philosophy loses its purpose the moment it becomes afraid to tell the truth, and that unwavering commitment to moral courage would become one of the defining features of his enduring legacy, ensuring that his voice continued shaping Chinese thought for centuries long after the kingdoms he traveled through had vanished into history. The final years of Mencius' life unfolded without the dramatic victories that many people expect from great philosophers. He never united China. He never became the chief advisor to an emperor who transformed the age according to his ideas. He did not witness the peaceful society he had spent decades describing. Instead, the kingdoms continued competing, rulers continued pursuing power, and wars continued shaping the lives of ordinary people. To some, that might seem like failure. Mencius would have disagreed. He understood something that history repeatedly teaches, but human beings repeatedly forget. The deepest ideas rarely change the world immediately. They grow quietly. One student influences another. One generation teaches the next. A single conversation alters a life, which later alters a family, which eventually shapes an entire society. The greatest victories of philosophy are often invisible while the philosopher is still alive. As Mencius grew older, he gradually withdrew from political travel and devoted more time to teaching his disciples. Together, they discussed the conversations he had held with kings, the moral questions that had troubled him throughout his life, and the principles he believed every generation would eventually need to confront again. His students carefully preserved these discussions. Centuries later, they became the book known simply as the Mencius, one of the 4 books that would eventually form the heart of Confucian education across East Asia. For nearly 2,000 years, scholars preparing for China's imperial examinations studied his words. Officials carried his ideas into government. Teachers passed them to children. Families repeated his stories around dinner tables. Very few philosophers have shaped the moral imagination of so many people for so long. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his legacy is how modern his questions still feel. Today we possess technologies Mencius could never have imagined. We communicate instantly across continents. We can cure diseases that once devastated civilizations. We have accumulated more scientific knowledge than every previous generation combined. Yet we continue asking the same moral questions. Can power exist without compassion? Can wealth exist without justice? Can education produce wisdom instead of merely producing success? Can societies become prosperous while neglecting the character of the people who live within them? Mencius believed these questions would never disappear because they are rooted in human nature itself. He would probably observe modern life with both admiration and concern. He would admire our knowledge, but he would ask whether our wisdom has grown at the same pace. He would admire our ability to build extraordinary cities, but he would wonder whether those cities help people become more compassionate or merely more distracted. He would celebrate medical progress, yet he would remind us that loneliness, resentment, and moral confusion cannot be cured by technology alone. For Mencius, the greatest danger facing civilization was never simply poverty or war. It was forgetting that every institution ultimately exists for human flourishing. Schools exist to cultivate character as well as intelligence. Governments exist to protect people rather than themselves. Economies exist to support life rather than consume it. Families exist to nurture virtue across generations. When these purposes are forgotten, societies may continue growing richer while becoming morally poorer. This is why Mencius insisted that inner cultivation must always accompany external progress. A civilization cannot remain healthy if its people become increasingly skilled while losing their capacity for empathy. Knowledge without virtue becomes manipulation. Power without compassion becomes oppression. Freedom without responsibility slowly destroys itself. These were not predictions. They were observations drawn from a lifetime spent watching human beings succeed and fail in remarkably similar ways. Perhaps his greatest contribution was changing how people understood goodness itself. Before Mencius, many viewed morality primarily as obedience to rules or traditions. Mencius invited people to look inward. He suggested that beneath fear, ambition, and selfishness there remains a quieter voice. The impulse that feels sorrow when another person suffers. The instinct that recoils from injustice. The conscience that whispers long before reason begins constructing excuses. That voice, he believed, is not weakness. It is the beginning of our humanity. The task of life is not to invent it. The task is to protect it from everything that slowly tries to silence it. When Mencius died around 289 BCE, the kingdoms of China were still divided. The peaceful and humane government he envisioned had not yet arrived. But ideas possess a patience that armies never do. Kingdoms disappear. Dynasties collapse. Borders change. Languages evolve. Yet the simple belief that human beings possess the capacity for goodness continued traveling across centuries. It inspired teachers to educate with hope rather than fear. It encouraged rulers to remember that legitimacy begins with the well-being of the people. It reminded parents that children inherit not only instructions but examples. And it challenged every generation to ask whether the world people create helps the best parts of human nature grow or slowly causes them to disappear. Perhaps that is why Mencius remains one of history's most enduring philosophers. He looked upon an age filled with violence and refused to believe violence defined humanity. He witnessed corruption without concluding that corruption was inevitable. He saw selfishness without surrendering hope. His optimism was not blind. It was disciplined. It demanded effort, education, self-reflection, and courage. But above all, it demanded faith in something many people overlook within themselves. That beneath habit, beneath fear, beneath anger, there still exists a small but living seed of compassion. And if it is patiently protected, carefully cultivated, and courageously practiced, it may yet grow into the force capable of transforming not only a single life, but an entire civilization.